Once upon a time back in August, I began to introduce the College Board's long-winded learning objectives. But I realize now that I failed to update these for the new course description that was released in 2019. The College Board has relabeled its learning objectives as art historical thinking skills. These are even more complex and even more long-winded, but it doesn't seem to me that what is expected of students has fundamentally changed. The first skill, visual analysis, is pretty straightforward. You need to be able to identify a work and to analyze the artist's choices of content and form. This unit has focused heavily on the second skill, context, specifically ways that a work of art reinforces a particular set of religious beliefs and practices. But we've also added a cultural context wrinkle. As major religions spread, their practices and their art reflected and accommodated these new cultures. So think of how Buddhism evolved when it encountered China's Confucian heritage or the samurai traditions of Japan. I have noticed that the new set of AP Classroom questions focuses more heavily on one aspect of context, how a particular audience would perceive a work based on its formal or visual qualities. Think, for example, of how Buddhist worshippers would respond to the enormous size of the Buddhas in the Bamiyan or Longmen caves, or to how worshippers respond to deep, mysterious passageways or to soaring, illuminated domes. Looking at a common religious tradition in varied cultural contexts creates a lot of opportunities to find similarities and differences, and this unit's long essay will ask you to explore these in the context of Buddhism. Some of the differences you observe will likely reflect the ways that a new religion merged with older traditions, continuity and change over time. So, for example, stupas are an older Indian architectural form, repurposed as reliquaries and venues for circumnavigation and contemplation. But continuity and change is hardly a new theme for us. We have already explored the extraordinary continuity of Egyptian art, the evolution of Greek art from the highly stylized archaic to the dynamic emotional Hellenistic, and the transition from depicting the Buddha only through symbols to the monumental Buddha sculptures of Bamiyan, Longmen Caves, and the Tudaiji Temple. Speeding up here. You've encountered unknown works now in both multiple choice and essay questions. These unknown works should always be quite similar to your required works, but you'll need to identify both visual and contextual reasons for attributing this work to a particular culture or, later in our course, to a particular artist. You encountered many competing interpretations in our first unit, partly because analyzing prehistoric art necessarily involves considerable guesswork. Just wait till you get to the wild and crazy world of global contemporary art. And finally, in your essays, you are learning to present claims about a work and to support these claims with specific visual and contextual evidence. That's argumentation. So, why am I throwing this list of required skills at you now? It's because I want you to think about why the College Board might have chosen these 4 particular mosques. Specifically, what might each of these 4 mosques tell us about change over time, or the influence of other works or even other cultures? What kind of special response do they elicit in worshipers, and what comparisons do they invite? So I'll share a few of my own conjectures. One of the most fascinating collisions of culture took place in Spain, where the Romans were defeated by Visigothic Christians, who were defeated by Muslims, who were defeated by Catholic Christians. The Mesquite of Cordoba tells the story in stone and tile, usually beautifully, sometimes jarringly. The Persians were innovators. They also married an ancient artistic tradition, the Iwan of Imperial Persian architecture, to the mosques of their new religion, Islam. The Ottoman Turks were all about proving that their art was even greater than the art of the people they conquered, the Byzantines. Yet the Byzantines also profoundly influenced Ottoman art. And Jenne is, of course, the largest building made of mud in the world, and a building that its community must essentially rebuild every year. Before we move on to these specific mosques, remember that you need to be able to identify the more or less universal elements of a mosque from a floor plan or a photo, and explain how these relate to the religious obligations of Islam, which I talked about in my last lecture. So let's start with the prayer hall. The mosque, masjid in Arabic, is above all the Muslim gathering place for prayer. Masjid simply means place of prostration. Though most of the 5 daily prayers prescribed in Islam can take place anywhere, all men are required to gather together at the mosque for the Friday noon prayer. The main mosque of a city used for the Friday communal prayer is called a Jame Masjid, or literally Friday Mosque, and it must accommodate all the men in that city. Here we see the prayer halls of our 4 mosques. Note that 2 of these, the mosques of Edirne and Isfahan, have open prayer halls, while Jenne and Cordoba have prayer halls broken up by columns. But let's focus now on the mosque at Cordoba, whose prayer hall is probably the most famous, at least in the West. The earliest mosques had hypostyle prayer halls. You've encountered that term before in Egypt, and you see 3 examples here. The Jenne Mosque is also hypostyle. So what's the problem with hypostyle rooms? Well, they can feel dark or closed off. And how did the architects of the Mosque of Cordoba try to solve this problem? Well, those double horseshoe arches raised the ceiling, letting in more light and also creating a geometric rhythm across the prayer hall. The famous alternating red and white voussoirs of the arches are made by alternating layers of brick and stone in the older parts of the mosque and with paint in the newer parts. They were inspired by the voussoirs in the Dome of the Rock pictured on the right. You need to know the term voussoir. As the diagram indicates, these are stones leading up to the keystone that holds the arch together. Horseshoe arches have been used on the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal, since late Roman times, but they are now associated especially with Islamic architecture. Of course, Islamic architects did not invent the arch. The Romans and then the Byzantines employed them in many important buildings and expanded their use into barrel vaults, groin vaults, and domes. But the Muslims adapted the arch in ways that I find especially beautiful. Here is an early version of the horseshoe arches you just saw. And here is the pointed or ogival arch that would become so iconic in Muslim architecture. The Muslims did not invent the pointed arch either. Architects borrowed these from the Sassanids of pre-Islamic Persia, but they used it brilliantly both for support and for decoration. This is from a mosque in Shiraz, Iran. Crusaders would bring the pointed arch to Europe, where, in an even more sharply pointed form, it would play an important role in the architectural revolution so brilliantly represented in Gothic cathedrals. Stay tuned. And speaking of influences across culture and change over time, the Mesquita of Cordoba is a poster child for works that borrow elements from other cultures and then transform them. The mosque was built on the site of a Visigothic Christian church, which was itself built on the site of a Roman temple. Indeed, for the first 70 years after the Muslim conquest, Muslims and Christians actually shared the space, each using half. The Muslim emir then purchased the Christian half, tore down the old church, and built this mosque. The emir was eager to show that his new capital rivaled those of Damascus and Baghdad. In fact, he brought an architect from Syria, and the mosque at Cordoba bears some resemblance to the great mosque at Damascus, which you saw in the video. The hypostyle hall of the Mosque of Cordoba had 856 columns carved from jasper, onyx, marble, and granite. Some of the columns in the prayer hall and the church that preceded it came from pieces of the Roman temple, which had occupied the site previously, as well as other destroyed Roman buildings. The art history vocabulary term for this, by the way, is spolia. Let's return to our generic mosque plan again and consider more elements of the Great Mosque at Cordoba. First, what do all those dots represent? They are columns indicating that this, like the Great Mosque at Cordoba, is a hypostyle mosque. Here is the College Board's required floor plan of the mosque at Cordoba with another diagram that I think helps make it clearer. And here is a floor plan again, but this time it shows the change in the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba over time, including the addition of a Catholic cathedral right in the center. Note that one feature of the second enlargement was construction of a large maksura right next to the mihrab for the exclusive use of Umayyad rulers. Not every mosque has a maqsura, but many of the most important mosques did. What the maqsura is a space reserved for the ruler and his court. It was actually apparently originally designed to help protect them from assassination. Islam was not a religion that embraced the separation of mosque and state. Rulers were responsible for maintaining both political order and religious conformity, and like rulers throughout history, they used religion to reinforce their legitimacy. At the same time, there has long been a tension between Muhammad's emphasis on social unity, the equality of believers, and the responsibility to the poor, and the highly hierarchical society and huge disparities of wealth that arose in most Muslim societies. Of course, Christianity has confronted the same contradictions. So here we see the maqsura at Cordoba with a view into the mihrab. Note that these later horseshoe arches have a more elaborate design. These are known as multi-lobed arches. And this required image shows horseshoe and multi-lobed arches together. This is the South Iwan of Isfahan's Jami or Friday Mosque, which also served as the maqsura, the space reserved for the Sultan. Ottoman mosques did not have maqsuras. Instead, the Sultan sat on a raised platform or loge, but still in a separate special place. I couldn't find a maqsura for the mosque at Jenne. It may be that the Sultan who converted to Islam and built the original mosque at Jenne included a maqsura, but the mosque that we are looking at was rebuilt by the French, and it dates from the early 20th century when Mali was a French colony. So probably no maqsura was considered necessary. By the way, the cupped semi-triangular niches that you see in the South Iwan are called muqarnas. They developed in Persia, but showed up in the art of North Africa and Islamic Spain as well, usually in half domes or apses. This is a good example of how artistic influences spread with Islam. Here you see even more elaborately carved muqarnas in the Hall of Sisters from the Nasri Dynasty Alhambra Palace in Granada, Spain. Next class. Back once again to that mosque floor plan. So, what do the circles in the floor plan represent? Well, those are domes, which in many mosques, even hypostyle mosques, are found over the mihrab or prayer niche in the Qibla wall. An interesting note about mihrabs, they are almost always set in the Qibla wall, or the wall facing Mecca. But as Islam spread across the world, how did Muslims know just where they were in relationship to Mecca? I remember learning in my early history classes that Muslim scholars made huge strides in mathematics and navigation, and it turns out that the driving force behind many of these discoveries was the need to figure out how to determine the direction of Mecca. Wondering where Mecca is from where you're sitting? There are several search engines on the web that help devout Muslims determine the direction they should turn to pray. I typed in the school address, and here you are. So, here are mihrabs from 3 of our required mosques. I couldn't find an interior mihrab photo for Jenne, but the wall with the 3 towers faces toward Mecca, and there is a mihrab below each tower. Here is the mihrab of the Mosque of Cordoba. Let's watch a short clip from a DVD, and you'll learn something surprising about this particular mihrab. So, now that you watched the video, which actually is now up on our Google Drive, what was the surprise? Well, this mosque faced not southeast toward Mecca, but south, imitating the Great Mosque of Damascus. By the way, the Khan Academy essay assigned for the homework got this wrong, but it's corrected in notes at the bottom of the article. So you saw this image of the mihrab dome in the video. Note the complex abstract mosaics, which also included calligraphy. These were the work of Byzantine mosaic artists, whose work was much admired and much hired in the Islamic world. I also want to draw your attention to another feature of Islamic art, abstract repeating geometric patterns or tessellations. You see such patterns in the dome and also in this example of Islamic tile. This fascination with geometric patterns seems to have grown out both of the mathematical studies and the limitations created by the requirement that the mosque images be aniconic, again, containing no zoomorphic figures. Still another characteristic feature of Muslim art and architecture was the arabesque, linear patterns of scrolling and interlacing foliage tendrils or plain lines. Art historians sometimes refer to flower and plant images as vegetal designs. And here's another example of an arabesque from a mosque in Central Asian city of Samarkand. Arabesques were commonly intermixed with calligraphy, as you see here. Before we leave Cordoba, I want to draw on your detective skills again. These are two of the College Board's required images of the mosque at Cordoba. You've seen the rest. So what's going on here? What might the College Board want you to think about as you look at these photos? Well, Cordoba has a cathedral basically jammed into and on top of a mosque. The Christians reconquered Cordoba in the 13th century. In 1236, the mosque was reconsecrated as a cathedral. Mainly, the openings leading from the patio courtyards were closed, and some Christian chapels were inserted. The minaret was also converted into a bell tower, as you see. Then in the 16th century, the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of Spain, Charles V, decided that this mosque church needed to look more like a real church. Over the objections of local Catholics who liked their mosque cathedral, he had his architects build a large Gothic Renaissance chancel right in the middle of the old mosque. Charles, who had not seen the mosque beforehand, later regretted his decision and reportedly exclaimed upon seeing the completed alteration, "You have built here what you or anyone might have built anywhere else, but you have destroyed what was unique in the world." So let's watch one more clip from our video, which shows the church within the mosque. Well, I've talked a lot about Mosque at Cordoba and a little about each of our other 4 mosques. Let's pause here and I'll return to finish up mosque architecture in my 3rd lecture on Islamic art.